Hello, everybody. This is a podcast, Everything About Hockey. Today, we're going to talk about the Cleveland Barons, a hockey team that played in Cleveland, Ohio in the late 70s. Exactly what happened and why that team had so much trouble. Now, as I'm going into this, you're going to find out that the fan base in Cleveland is a dedicated hockey fan base. But this is what happens when you have ownership that have no idea what they're doing, and they just drive a franchise right into the ground. Let's first start off with the Cleveland Barons of the American Hockey League, which at the time was the AAA league of the NHL. They played from the 1940s to 1970s. They were also considered one of the big fish in the American Hockey League. They were a big market team in a minor league situation. And because of that, they were averaging around 8,000 to 10,000 people per game in the old Cleveland Arena in downtown Cleveland. And because of the success of their AHL team, there was a couple rumors in the 60s that Cleveland might be able to get an NHL team, but that was just all rumors. Nothing ever really came of that. But Nick Milletti, the owner of the Cleveland Barons, never really thought himself as a minor league owner. So in the 1970s, he managed to acquire an NBA team called the Cleveland Cavaliers to play in the Cleveland Arena in downtown Cleveland, because his ultimate goal was to build a state-of-the-art arena in downtown Cleveland and also to get an NHL team in Cleveland too, because he really thought that Cleveland could handle supporting all four major league sports at that time. Of course, at the very end, NHL decided to go to other locations, Buffalo, Vancouver, and that kind of left Cleveland out with no NHL team, no high-level hockey team. So then they discovered that the World Hockey Association was setting up, and he decided he would contact them to see if he could get a WHA team. And he was going to call them the Cleveland Crusaders. Of course, in his eyes, he still thought that Cleveland could support two hockey franchises, an AHL team, American Hockey League team, which is a AAA team, and a World Hockey Association team. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. The AHL team, which was averaging 8,000 to 10,000 a game, by the time this all came about, they were only averaging 1,000 people a game. And the Crusaders, the World Hockey Association team, they were barely getting 6,000 a game. So he decided to fold the American Hockey League team and let it go into relocation status, and it did, and it got transferred to Florida. So now Cleveland only had one team again, the World Hockey Association, Cleveland Crusaders. Because of all this turmoil, the Crusaders are only averaging 54% capacity for that arena when all this came about. Now, in the 72-73 season, they were only averaging 5,287 fans per game. In the third year, they did have a bump in increasing attendance to 6,212 people. So it really did kind of hurt them right off the bat. Another thing hurt them was the NBA, National Basketball Association, Cleveland Cavaliers, were also having some success on the court and in the box office at the exact same time this was all going on. And the funny part about it was there was a rumor at that time in 1972 that the NHL did offer the ownership a chance to have an NHL team, and the ownership of the World Hockey Association and the NBA Cleveland Cavaliers told them no thanks. Nick Milletti, the owner, the majority owner, really felt that the World Hockey Association was really going to develop into a high-end elite league. And the ownership group that really ran the World Hockey Association was really thinking outside the box during this time frame. So, it looked really bright, the World Hockey Association, when all this was going on. And they had a really die-hard group in 1972 when they started, October 1972. The fans called themselves the Purple Gang. So you had some pretty hardcore hockey fans that was really supporting this World Hockey Association team. In 1974, the Cleveland Crusaders, the World Hockey Association team, moved out of downtown Cleveland to a new arena called the Richfield Coliseum, 25 miles from downtown Cleveland, 15 miles from downtown Akron. The cost of the arena, the new home of the World Hockey Association, Cleveland Crusaders, and the NBA Cleveland Cavaliers, was going to cost them $35 million. Jay Moore, the owner of this new Richfield Coliseum, had a vision that this thing is going to be an economic boom for this area. They plan on having hotels and restaurants all around the place. It was going to be a destination, not only people from Cleveland, but people from also Akron, Canton area, because they had the new World Hockey Association, Cleveland Crusaders, and the NBA National Hockey Basketball Association, Cleveland Cavaliers. But unfortunately, because of the location of this place, it was very hard to get to games if you're from Cleveland or from Canton, Akron area. They only had one highway access this thing. And of course, in the wintertime when it snowed or ice, it would be almost impossible to get to this place. And there was always lines backed up on the road to try to get into the parking lot. When the Cavaliers were playing in the conference championship games, it was like an hour and a half wait just to get in the parking lot. And because of that, the team lost attendance, and of course the media coverage dwindled pretty quickly at that point in time. And then result of the Cleveland Cavaliers had success, most of the sports fans paid more attention to the Cavaliers than they did the Crusaders, which caused the Crusaders to reconsider staying in Cleveland, or is it better for them to relocate to another location? So it was announced in the Plain Dealer on June the 22nd, 1975, that the Cleveland Crusaders of the World Hockey Association was going to move to Hollywood, Florida, and play their home games there. Of course, Jay Moore, the owner of the Richfield Coliseum, realized at that point in time that half of his income has now been lost. So he decided if he's going to try to get an NHL team to move to Cleveland. And he attempted to do that with the Kansas City Scouts, but that deal fell through. Let's do a little history here. In the NHL, the original 6 teams in 1942 to 1967 was Detroit, Toronto, Chicago, Boston, Montreal, New York Rangers. So in 1967, they decided to double the size of the league and add 6 more teams, which were the Philadelphia Flyers, Pittsburgh Penguins, St. Louis Blues, LA Kings, Minnesota North Stars, and the California Golden Seals. Now let's look at the California Golden Seals. They were based in Oakland, but also played a short amount of time in San Francisco. They were the least successful of these original 6 expansion teams. They never had a winning record, and they only made the playoffs twice. And the team never drew well. Attendance was so poor that talk of relocation began as early as the inaugural season. However, the U.S. television contract with CBS required 2 teams in California, one in L.A. and one in Oakland. At the exact same time, the California Golden Seals were suffering the same fate in the Bay Area as San Francisco. And Cleveland natives George and Gordon Gunn were minority owners of this NHL California Golden Seals team. The major owner, his name was Melvin Swing. He was a real estate investor in the Oakland area. He bought the team from the league in 1975 for $3.5 million. This team, during a whole entire lifetime, was constantly having troubles with trying to draw fans. They were making no money whatsoever. It was a real problem for this franchise. Now, the NHL required them to play in San Francisco from the TV deal they had back in the early 70s. Once that TV deal expired, they were allowed to move this franchise to wherever they wanted. But unfortunately, when that TV deal expired, they still had 2 more years on their lease in the Bay Area before they were eligible to move. But the Gunn brothers saw what was going on in Cleveland, and they really wanted to move this franchise to Cleveland, Ohio. They saw the new arena sitting there, and it was a 10,000-seat arena, state-of-the-art, brand new. They were really pushing to get this team in Cleveland. This is when the massive troubles start to begin. Of course, the Bay Area hockey fans at that point in time knew this team wasn't going to last much longer. But during the initial scouting, that ownership group went to Cleveland and looked at the arena, walked around the arena, met Jay Moore. They went to Cleveland, looked around Cleveland, but the odd part about it was they really didn't have any contact with the city council or the mayor of Cleveland, and very little contact with the plain dealer, the newspaper for the city of Cleveland. Remember, the majority owner, Melvin Swing, never had been to Cleveland before this. He's a investor in Oakland, California. This is his first time ever being in Cleveland. Now, the Gunn brothers, they're from Cleveland, so they had an idea what to expect. But you would think a guy that had never been in Cleveland before, and a majority owner of an NHL team, would make some contact with city council and the media. But you also got to remember, this is his first visit, and he hadn't even started to discuss with the Board of Governors a possibility of relocation from San Francisco to Cleveland. So maybe that was a factor. I don't know. But I just find it kind of odd that you at least would touch base with these people. Let me back up here real quickly. Just in case you don't know, the Board of Governors are current owners of the NHL teams. They call themselves the Board of Governors. They're the ones who determine what goes on in the NHL at that point in time. Who becomes NHL franchises, where they go, and how the NHL is ran. This is the group he has yet to talk to about possibly moving to Cleveland. He's also yet to talk to Clarence Campbell, the president of the NHL. Back then they called it the president, now they call it commissioner. So I guess you could call it president/commissioner of the NHL. He has yet to make contact with this guy either. But he is aware of the possibility of moving because he knows the TV deal is expired and he knows the financial problems Oakland/San Francisco has had with the California Golden Seals. So he knows it's still possible they're going to move. So when Melvin Swing did decide to write a written formal letter asking the NHL Board of Governors to place a transfer of California Golden Seals to Cleveland, Ohio, the NHL president, Clarence Campbell, tried to put a slowdown on this process. In a written statement, he said, this is Clarence Campbell, the president of the NHL, he saw more evidence of the move he was hastily arranged without the necessary investors, local investors, and the ownership group didn't spend enough time planning the move with the proper city officials. In other words, he was saying he didn't think the ownership group spent enough time with local politicians, local media, and the business community in Cleveland to make sure they were on board for this move to take place. Also, Mr. Campbell also knew enough about the Richfield Coliseum to be concerned. The Coliseum was 25 miles from downtown Cleveland, where, of course, the NBA Cleveland Cavaliers played, and he actually saw the problems they had when the Cleveland Cavaliers were playing in the division championship game. Fans were backed up for miles along I-271 from Richmond Coliseum to Cleveland. The NHL Board of Governors, which are the other owners, were also concerned too. Having been burned by failed franchises in the past, Kansas City, also Denver, and now Oakland, they were worried about this possibility too, happening again. The Board of Governors were really concerned that the current owners of the California Golden Seals had not yet set up a bank loan to stabilize the team finances in Cleveland. So right now, the Board of Governors decided to set up some ground rules for this team to transfer from San Francisco to Cleveland. First off, they required them to have at least 6,000 season ticket holders. Secondly, they wanted a working relationship with the local media. The newspaper, they wanted to make sure they had a beat writer covering this team at all times during the season, and they also wanted to have a radio station that would cover all the games on the air. And then the third one And the most important one was they wanted to make sure this thing was financially stable. So they wanted to have a financial institution in Cleveland help them finance the team. So what do? They decided to pick a radio station that only had 5,000 watts, WILN in Cleveland, which is a smaller station, over the 50,000 watt WWNE, which also broadcasts the home games and the road games for the NBA, National Basketball Association, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Major League Baseball, Cleveland Indians, which had such a strong signal, everybody in the northeast part of Ohio could hear. But the radio station they picked, WILN, you could only hear in Cleveland because it had such a weak signal. Even though they're playing in Richfield Coliseum, was 25 miles from downtown Cleveland, and also it didn't have enough strength to get to the Kenton-Akron area. So they wouldn't be able to, the Kenton-Akron area wouldn't be able to hear home and road games on the radio, which was the whole idea why the Cavaliers and the Barons moved to the Coliseum. So it could be a regional team for the northeast part of Ohio. Then they tried to get the 6,000 season ticket holders, but they could only get a little over 5,000 people willing to commit to be season ticket holders. So the league kind of had to waive that rule off too. Then you also got to remember, this team was moved within 4 months with little promotions, and the owners never did make contact with the city leaders, the city commissioners, and the mayor. But they did boast in the newspaper that the ownership group spent $50,000 for advertising that first year. But during that same time frame, the Plain Dealer, the newspaper in Cleveland, reported saying that the reporters repeatedly tried to contact this ownership group. But every time they called, they left a message, but the ownership group never did call them back or never did show up at the newspaper to talk to them. Now, I admit, you're moving a team in 4 months. There is a lot of things to do. So I'm sure they didn't have a whole lot of free time to hang out at radio stations and newspapers. But you have to still make contact with these people because you know you're going to need them later on to promote the team. But regrettably, the Board of Governors, the people that are actually in charge of actually determining which team to go where, remember, they're the owners of the current NHL teams, did approve the California Golden Seals to Cleveland, Ohio, and become the new Cleveland Barons. They had training camp, which was a little chaotic, but all training camps are that way. You know, you do have contracts you're trying to straighten out, evaluate young guys, typical NHL training camp. Opening night, the Cleveland Barons played the New York Rangers, and they won it 4-1. Their attendance, though, was only 4,255, a little low. But unfortunately, throughout that season, they had bad attendance and bad performance on the ice. It meant that team, the first year, lost the money. And also, you got to remember, this team still owed money in San Francisco when this group bought, at the time, the California Golden Seals for $2.7 million. And since they didn't make any money that first year, and they still was obligated to pay the players their salaries, the front office staff their salaries, rent for the building, operation costs there, and of course paying the loan after they purchased the team. This basically drained those three guys' savings accounts down to nothing already this first season. Remember, they didn't go out and try to get a local bank to give them a loan to help them finance through this rough time of the first couple years. So next summer, they already started having rumbles of information coming out that the team was thinking about trying to reduce salary costs and also try to get the Coliseum ownership to reduce their rent so they could actually, have enough money to pay everybody off. Then they also started talking to the Board of Governors to see if they could help them fund the team a little bit for a while. And then they also started talking to the National Hockey League Players Association to see if they could get them to help them out of this rough spot by having them reduce their salaries. So, the red flags were already starting to pop up here. that these three guys really didn't have any idea what they were doing. They already messed up a team in San Francisco, and now it's starting to happen again in Cleveland. Then there was reports in the Cleveland newspaper that John Ziegler, he's actually the NHLPA's president, not a salary reduction, but the ownership group of the Cleveland Barons wanted to see if they could get the NHLPA to give them a loan to help them pay the Cleveland Baron players. In other words, the players on the other teams are going to help pay the Cleveland Barons ownership, pay the Cleveland Barons players' salaries. They were wanting at least a $250,000 loan to be able to accomplish this. Then they also talked to the Board of Governors about them helping them pay the operating costs for the Cleveland Barons hockey team, and they wanted $300,000 from the Board of Governors, which are the other owners. And at the same time, the Richfield Coliseum got a little worried because they thought they were going to lose another hockey team. So the ownership group of the Cleveland Barons decided to give them an offer. Instead of actually reducing their rent, Mr. Greenberg, the actual owner of the Richfield Coliseum, could become a minority owner of the Cleveland Barons. The value of this thing would be $500,000. Of course, he did agree to this because he didn't want to have hockey leave Cleveland. He wanted to make sure there was two teams in his building. And the Board of Governors and the players' unions were also happy because now they had a local investor that lived in Cleveland as part of the ownership group. So the players' union and the Board of Governors agreed to give them the money they needed so they could play next year. Remember, that money was just to cover debts from last year. They still had to come up with the same amount of money next year. So summer proceeds, and they managed to get their team organized. They managed to pay the front office staff. They managed to pay their hockey operations staff. So they decided to break camp in University of Kenton on their ice surface for the next season's training camp. But there still was some hard feelings from some of the players because of the delay in paying the year before, and they really weren't too sure if they wanted to continue playing for this team, knowing their financial limitations. That's when some of the player agents discovered a loophole in the CBA, which is called the Collective Bargain Agreement, which is a guidelines they set for how contracts are structured for the NHL. If you have a contract with a team and they don't pay you for 2 months, you become an unrestricted free agent, which was stated in that year's CBA. Now, it's been changed since then, but that's how the CBA was written in the early 70s. During my research, I found that fascinating that they had that in there. And I never could figure out which side put it in there. Was it the owners that put that in there, or was it the players that put that in there? Because at that time, there was a lot of teams, not a lot, I should say. There was a few teams, Kansas City, Denver, Cleveland, that all had some financial troubles. Pittsburgh was also another team, had some financial troubles at that point in time. The Cleveland Barons broke training camp, and the season started like normal. A lot more losses than wins, poor attendance, and the media really wasn't covering it the way they thought they should. And, of course, the radio wasn't as strong as it should be because of the weaker signal that they picked for the radio station. So people tended to ignore this team again for another year, and the financial trouble started back up again. The ownership decided to cut back on paying the front office staff, their hockey operations staff, and then they also discussed another reduction in costs for the players. Another example of history repeating itself. And there's also reports from the media that the ownership group was hardly ever in Cleveland. The media said they had a hard time even contacting them again to get interviews and comments about what's going on with the team. Because at the time, the general manager and the hockey operations staffs were just doing trades just to get their Cleveland Barons name in the newspaper and on the radio. At least that's what it looked like to me. Then, of course, the ownership group decided to make a public announcement that the team could possibly fold in February. But they needed still another $1.3 million to keep this team going for the rest of the year. So they contacted the NHL Board of Governors again. They wanted to know if they could get another $350,000 from them. NHLPA, they wanted $600,000 from them just to keep this thing going. Of course, at the same time, the players weren't getting paid again. They knew the clause in the CBA that said if they don't get paid for 2 months, they could become unrestricted free agents and go wherever they want. Any team they wanted for the rest of the season, they could just sign up for. And, of course, the Board of Governors, which are the people that run the NHL, the owners that run the NHL, were scared to death of this because they knew that the high-end group of players were going to go to the elite teams, and there would be even bigger gap between the good teams and the bad teams. Remember, there was no salary cap in 1970s for the NHL, so teams could spend as much money as they liked on players. And the NHL union didn't like it because they got dues for all the players that played in the NHL. If a team folded, that would be less players for the NHLPA executive committee to collect dues from. And they knew these lower players weren't going to get contracts with the remaining teams. They were going to lose money because they weren't going to be able to collect the union fees from these players. Also at the same time, Mr. Greenberg, the actual owner of the Richfield Coliseum and part owner of this Cleveland Barons team, was also shopping his part of the ownership group of the Cleveland Barons. He wanted to sell that off and get away from this hockey team because I think he realized the three original owners had no idea what they were doing. So in order to sell his part, he had a pretty interesting concept. What he thought he would do is he thought he'd get offers from 45 limited partnerships that own the ownership of the Cleveland Barons. Each partnership would cost $150,000, and you could spread that out over 4 years. So it would give the opportunity for the fans to actually be part of the Cleveland Barons ownership, kind of like what the Green Bay Packers do, where it's actually owned by all the fans and not just a corporation. Of course, he wins here too. He gets out of being an owner of the Cleveland Barons. He still gets to have a team playing in his arena, Richfield Coliseum, but also would give a chance to have a stable, large group of people that was an investment in the Cleveland Barons. They could have a say in what they were doing. Of course, he couldn't find enough people to do this deal. So he ended up selling his part back to Marvin Swagan, the major owner of the Cleveland Barons. So he did get out of owning the Barons, but the three still original owners still had total control of his team with very little financial support and also AWOL a lot of times. Now at the same time, they started doing the same thing with the not paying the front office staff, deciding not to pay the players on a regular scheduled basis. And because of that, the Baron players decided they were going to go ahead and start contacting other teams to find out if they would be interested in signing them as unrestricted free agents. And at All-Star break that year, the rumors really started to kick in that this team could fold even before the season was up, because they've already was in debt for $2.4 million at this point in time. And the workers were unpaid for the last 2 months. So Marvin Swag, the majority owner, contacted the Board of Governors and wanted to know if there was any possibility that they could get another bailout. And he also asked the Players Union if the players for the Barons would take a 27% pay cut to help him finish out this season. Of course, the Players Union turned that request down right away. That was a no-brainer. Now, the League Board of Governors, which are the original owners, still had to do a scenario planning of what would happen if they did fold the team at this point in time, how a dispersal draft would work, and what the league would look like after that happened. To try to take some control of this team, Alan Ingleson, the players' rep, executive director, met with the Cleveland Barons players on February the 23rd, 1977, and his whole purpose was to try to calm them down, get them to go back to the Barons team, and try to finish out the season. And one of the things he basically did was he agreed that he would actually help pay the cost of their salaries for the remaining season to get them back on that team, because he knew this was going to be a big, colossal mess if they went and had a fold and had a dispersal draft for these players. And of course, the players did agree to it once they found out the players' union was going to guarantee that every penny that they were supposed to earn that year, they were going to get. They decided all to go back and play for the Cleveland Barons and finish out the season. So to get through the season, majority owner Marvin Swing decided to, well, he wasn't decided. He was required to put up $350 million. The 17 owners of all the teams were going to put up another $20 million. And the NHLPA brought out a loan so they could get $60 million collected so they could actually finish out the season. But one stipulation is that Marvin Swing had to sell his interest to the team to the Gunn brothers in order for them to actually do any of this. So now only have two people own this team, and that was the Gunn brothers from Cleveland. That was because the Board of Governors felt that major owner Swing was not suited to be an NHL owner. That was actually reported in the local Cleveland newspaper. To attempt to save the team, the Gunn brothers did try to pour a lot of money in this team through marketing and promotions, interested in watching Barons hockey. And it did work. They had a couple winning streaks, couple three-game winning streaks. And they boosted attendance to 12,857 for those little winning streaks. So it tended to work a little bit. Also, during the same time, Harry Hallow, the GM of the Cleveland Barons, did pull off several trades to improve the quality of the players of his team. And he actually made the team a lot better. They got to be a lot tougher, and they got a little bit more skill involved in this roster. Of course, then the team went back to normal playing, and their aggressive marketing and promotions kind of fell apart. And then they started averaging the normal 7,000 average per game fans. And that was even including a 3-game winning streak at the very end of the season. It didn't really help surge attendance anymore. Then, of course, at the end of the season, the Baron hockey team barely registered on the Cleveland sports landscape. Media basically started just ignoring it again. Faced it after 2 years, the damage was already done. The Cleveland sports fans were already pretty well fed up with how this Barons team's management ran the team. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, the Minnesota hockey team was having the same financial problems the Barons had. Bad attendance, bad play on the ice, and they were about ready to fold too. So the Gunn brothers began talking to the ownership of the North Stars about a possible merger. Now, the league really wasn't that really thrilled about the idea of having two teams merge, but when they considered the possibility that they could have two teams fold, then the idea of merging two teams and having just one team survive and only having one team lost really wasn't that bad of an idea. And, of course, the players' union also kind of liked that idea, too. Instead of losing two teams' players, they were only going to lose one team's group of the players. So on June the 14th, 1978, the Board of Governors, which are the original owners, decided to approve and grant final approval, actually, of the merger of the Cleveland Barons and the Minnesota North Stars. So now there was going to be one big team. I guess your question now would be, how did that work? Well, I'll tell you how that worked. They were going to keep the team in Minnesota. They were going to change the North Stars' name, color, and history, with the wealthy Gunn brothers as the major owner of the North Stars. This means that the Cleveland Barons were going to fold in 1978. This was the first time in 31 years in NHL history that a team has folded. The last time it folded was Montreal Maroons in 1947, after they couldn't secure a team in a building. And it's the last time a team has folded in NHL history. While the North Stars continue to struggle financially and at the box office, the Gunn brothers decided to sell that franchise, and then they decided to look to bring another team back to the Bay Area. By the late 80s, the North Stars decided they were going to relocate to another city. The league blocked it a couple times, but in 1991, the Gunn brothers sold the team and granted an expansion franchise for the San Jose Sharks. For a compromise for doing all this, the Board of Governors, a special dispersal an expansion draft, which would include the Sharks claiming 16 North Star players in a dispersal draft. Both teams then allowed to choose players in the existing expansion draft. Then the new North Stars owner ultimately moved the team to Dallas, became the Dallas Stars, which is where that franchise plays to this day. Of course, because of the horrifically bad ownership of the Cleveland Barons, the fans of Cleveland would never see another hockey team for another 14 years, until 1992, when former World Hockey League owner Nick Maletti decided to purchase the Muskegon Lumberjacks of the IHL, which is the International Hockey League, which is a AAA league, and move them to Cleveland and play them, that new team, in the Richfield Coliseum as the Cleveland Lumberjacks. On October 10th, 1992, the Cleveland Lumberjacks beat the Cincinnati Cyclones 4-2 in their inaugural game in front of 7,239 fans. But during their time in the IHL, the team averaged 5,220 fans per game. Unfortunately, that league folded. But the interesting part of this whole thing was that the Cleveland Barons, the AHL, when they played their 2 years in the Richfield Coliseum, their average attendance never topped 4,227 fans. Another weird twist occurred when the IHL did fold in the early 2000s. The next season, there was an AHL team, American Hockey League team, which was another AAA team, moved to Cleveland, owned by George and Gordon Gunn. Sounds familiar? They were still part owners of the San Jose Sharks. They purchased a team in Lexington, Kentucky called the Kentucky Thoroughbreds, which was their AAA team for the San Jose Sharks, and moved that team to Cleveland. Of course, they renamed the team from the Kentucky Thoroughblades to the Cleveland Barons. Go figure. They still have a hockey team in Cleveland, American Hockey League team, but now the team plays in downtown Cleveland, and it's gone through several other affiliations and new ownership groups. At one time, they were affiliated with the Colorado Avalanche, and now they're affiliated with the Columbus Blue Jackets as the Columbus Blue Jackets AAA team. And it took the NHL 20 years to commit to go back to Ohio when they awarded the expansion franchise to a city of Columbus called the Columbus Blue Jackets, which is becoming a pretty stable franchise with a solid fan base, about 15,000 people a crowd per game. To top it off, longtime hockey fanatics in Cleveland finally got to celebrate a championship, American Hockey League championship, a Calder Cup in the city of Cleveland. This kind of shows you how bad an ownership group can destroy a franchise. I mean, those three guys never really was able to grasp the concept of growing the fan base in Cleveland. They were just too busy trying to make a quick buck, and it really is sad. Then you look at the Columbus Blue Jackets when they were awarded expansion in 2000, when John H. McConnell, the majority owner, really went out of his way to connect the Columbus Blue Jackets with the city of Columbus and really build a solid fan base, a solid media relationship. And now the whole entire McConnell family is really tried to maintain that. And now we're seeing a real great fan base, the fifth line, and a team that struggles on the ice, but always seemed to have stable ownership and hockey management. And what do you know? They've been awarded to play in their first outdoor game in February 1st, 2025 at the Horseshoe in Columbus against the Detroit Red Wings. So it kind of shows you that hockey does work in Ohio. You just need the right ownership and develop a great relationship with the fan base and the media. And it also has worked in other places too. It's not just Cleveland and Columbus have had success on the ice and off the ice with their hockey teams. Look at Toledo with the Toledo Storm and the Toledo Walleye. They've won championships throughout the years. They've got a solid fan base, an unbelievable fan base. They've really embraced hockey in Toledo. And then in Cincinnati with the Cincinnati Cyclones, they've won championships. They've had a solid fan base too. So, hockey works in Ohio. You just need the right ownership that really wants to build the fan base for that city and get the media connected with that team. If you also want to go through and listen to another ownership group that totally destroyed their team, I got one about the Phoenix Coyotes or the Arizona Coyotes already recorded on my podcast channel. That's an interesting listen too. The podcast is called NHL Hockey Arizona Coyotes Relocation Scenarios. And it describes in quite detail how an ownership group and a city government can destroy hockey real quickly if they don't know what they're doing. Of course, because of bad ownership, the league was forced to relocate the Arizona Coyotes out of Phoenix to Salt Lake City, Utah, and become the Salt Lake City, Utah. I have no idea what the nickname's going to be. And they're going to play in the same basketball arena as the Utah Jazz plays in. So I'm going to get a little sidetrack here on all this stuff. Sorry about that. But thanks for listening to my podcast. This is Everything Hockey. I really appreciate you listening to this. And goodbye.